Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Dr. Corrali, mindful of the time and also a number of your responses which indicate that the inquiry may now be better placed to making requests of other persons for information and documentation, what I'm now going to do is ask you just about various topics within your statement for a short time before we have a break to see if anything else has arisen. I remind you and the record, of course, that everything within your statement is evidence that has been presented and will be taken into account by the inquiry. Can I pick up on an entirely separate topic? I'm going to leave restricted practices behind now and move to the question of risk management. You begin the question of risk management or the issue of mismanagement at paragraph 258 of your statement. And as you said repeatedly in various ways yesterday, risk is viewed by the Trust as being dynamic and multi-dimensional. What was the core inpatient document at the relevant time which the staff working at EPUT would be expected to consult to inform themselves of a patient's key current and historic risk factors? What would they look at? Would it be the initial 72-hour care plan or a risk assessment plan? Where would they go for that information?
The clerking notes by the junior doctor would have some information on the risks and the risk management. The CPA care plan would have information on the risk and risk management.
In paragraph 258, you make reference to the concept of positive risk-taking, and for the record, it's something you refer to in paragraph 133. What do you mean by positive risk-taking?
It's the concept which Dr. Davidson mentioned about therapeutic balance between therapeutic care and the risk. When we can, the idea of giving patient leave is part of the treatment. Leave is a part of the treatment, but leave also brings certain risks. When patient goes out of the ward has very little control over what happens outside. So that's what I mentioned about positive risk taking. So you do give leave, you don't stop leave because patient might harm, but you take into consideration what are the factors. Is it the right time to give leave? Is the patient recovered enough to start having some leave? But you put in some safeguards. So you start with an escorted leave, then accompanied leave, and then unescorted leave. So that's positive risk taking.
At paragraph 265, you state that managing risk and ensuring therapeutic care, which I think is what you've just referred to, is getting the balance right to ensure that the recovery process is maintained for the patient. What do you think, or where do you think, I should say, EPUT and the predecessor trusts have been in terms of the balance struck between risk management and avoidance and therapeutic care over the relevant period? What has the approach been overall?
It's always been a clinical decision. It's always a clinical decision based on the mental state, how much patient has recovered, to decide whether it's the right time to give leave or not. It rests with the consultant. For patients who are under the Mental Health Act, there is a formal responsibility of a consultant. The leave is granted on what is called as a Section 17. It's a formal leave. And likewise for patients who are informal, it's the consultant with the MDT who decide what is the best time to start giving patient leave.
That deals with leave specifically. But what was the Trust's approach overall to risk management versus balancing it up with therapeutic care? Has it changed, evolved over time?
We heard from Dr. Davidson that there was a preoccupation of the risk assessments in the health sector and health services, and if things would go wrong, the first thing would be asked in an internal investigation is, have the risk assessments been done? What is the nature and the quality of risk assessment is a different matter. And I think more recently, nationally, it's been recognized the impact it has had on the mental health services, and that applies to the services in Essex as well. Move away from filling forms and focusing on therapeutic care.
You say it's now the focus in Essex. Was there or is there anything now in place to prevent or to move away from an over-focus on risk management over providing therapy?
The new operating model makes it clear. We are not talking about safety plans as mentioned by Dr. Davidson rather than risk management plans, and that takes into account the strengths of the patient, the support system he or she has, and what help the patient can seek when on leave he or she needs help and assistance. And also the therapeutic activities that are on the ward are more focused on therapeutic care, providing the activity coordinators that have been recently appointed, the peer support workers. They're all meant to increase the therapeutic milieu on the ward.
Yesterday you gave some evidence about the community mental health framework, and in paragraph 280 of your statement you refer to the CPA in the section of your statement dealing with care plans. You gave evidence about the proposed move away from the CPA. As far as you're concerned or aware, does the introduction of the CMHF at EPUT have any implications for care planning and the role or the use of care plans in inpatient admissions?
So for the inpatient services, there are certain other set of recommendations which I think Dr. Davidson touched about, the 10 key essential, and that's been very much part of the new operating model of creating new roles like peer support workers and how do we involve families, family support workers. 72-hour discharge, we have 48-hour discharge. The red to green is again part of that 10 working principles. So inpatient, yes, we have taken the guidance that's come out nationally.
Can I ask this question, both now and as proposed? Who is responsible for the care plans?
Care plans is usually nurses who prepare the care plans. There's a slight distinction between a treatment plan and a care plan. The treatment plan is where a doctor on the ward round would decide what the diagnosis is, what the medication, what the psychological treatments, any treatments for any other medical conditions like diabetes, and at the point of discharge, what medications the patient should go on. When you talk about care plan, it involves housing, spiritual needs. It's a more overall document including all aspects of care, which is predominantly completed by nursing staff.
A slightly separate question. In paragraph 293 of your statement, you say that the MDT will consider any trauma a patient has experienced to obtain a better understanding of the patient's care needs. How do the MDT inform themselves of that past trauma, especially given the issues we've heard about with accessing patient records sometimes?
There's a lot of focus on trauma-informed care now. The Trust has a transformation project on rolling out trauma-informed care. It is about the trauma a person experiences in his or own life. The patient might have had admission to that particular ward and might have had a not so good experience and how that impacts on that. So that's all, it's led by the psychology department. So it's an ongoing program of making all services trauma-informed and trauma-aware.
But how do they find out about the previous trauma?
It's history-taking information, gathering information, talking to the families.
Talking to the families, did you say? So the key information from
Yes.
the families. Moving on, as I said,
Wherever possible.
Wherever possible. Mindful of the time, can I just ask you some questions about discharge and follow-up, bearing in mind you've set out some a lot of information within your statement, which begins at paragraphs 295. What is the role of the discharge coordinator?
The role of the discharge coordinator is to ensure that any obstacles to discharges are addressed at the beginning of the admission itself. It is to ensure that patients, once they are medically optimized in the sense they are well enough to be discharged, that they don't land up staying on the ward for aftercare arrangements.
What is the professional background of the discharge coordinator usually?
Usually they've been nursing staff. So every old age ward has had a band 6. Each ward has, for adult services, we have, each locality has one, and the 2 assessments have. But more recently, we've gone for wider profession. So it could be someone from a housing background who understands, what could be the housing-related barriers to discharge.
So all manner of professionals could be discharged. More recently. By more recently, when do you mean?
I think because it was traditionally, this is through the time to care approach. So prior to time to care was introduced, the discharge coordinators were nurses.
If the discharge coordinator is somebody who is responsible for housing or accommodation or from a different agency, how does that work in practice? How do they attend meetings, facilitate?
They're not responsible as such. They are, I think, facilitators. They will identify where the blockage is and identify those blockages and help the team to address those blockages. Earlier, it was only reliant on the care coordinator to address any issues outside the ward. So if the patient required a placement, it was incumbent on the care coordinator to fill the relevant forms, take it to the panel. But now with the activity with the discharge coordinators, there is that greater support to plan, to identify obstacles and plan the aftercare.
Your statement at paragraphs 535 and then on from 539 to 545, which I won't go to, appear to set out a number of challenges faced by discharge coordinators. You say that in your statement that discharge coordinators are present at most discharge planning meetings, but yet at paragraph 539 you say that due to a limited team capacity, the team currently engages with more complex discharges, rather suggesting that they can only come to certain patient cases, if that makes sense. What is the position?
So they personally would involve in certain patients, not every, but they would have, and this is going forward. I'm talking about this is more recent, that every patient admitted, the discharge coordinator will undertake a review and identify the barriers to discharge, but would not personally get involved in each and every patient. They might identify 2 or 3 patients where there are likely to be more complexities in discharging and then get personally involved.
You say this is going forward. Is this an area, to use a word we've used a few times during your evidence, this is an area where your evidence may be considered aspirational to a certain extent?
Rather than aspirational, this has been introduced through the new operating model and the time to care. So a number of these posts have been appointed, the roles have been set. What I refer to as these services were not available a few years ago.
You say at 543 that the discharge coordinators are likely to benefit from the implementation of the new operating model and the multiple work streams that are ongoing. What do you mean by that, and how will they be benefited?
So there are the focus on housing, there are other roles like activity coordinators and others that would work as a part of the team in assisting the discharge coordinators. The new operating model focuses on keeping patient no longer than that's required. That's the main focus, and that focuses, and that's the whole number of new appointments have been made, peer support workers, family support workers. So it's about how these people can work with families and patients, and it's a team effort. So the focus is on, so they're not working in isolation. I think that's probably what's being mentioned there.
Is there any standardised template or best practice guidance, or was there, setting out what at a minimum a discharge plan must contain?
A minimum discharge plan will have, discharge summary is an example, will have the diagnosis.
I don't want to cut across you, but was there a template or any guidance as to what you're giving your view of what it should contain in your experience, but was there
There's a template for a discharge summary which will have the treatment plan, the aftercare arrangements.
Would that be an e-put template?
That would be an e-put template.
Do you agree at discharge that a crisis plan is also of fundamental importance?
That's correct.
You talked about the blockages, and you talked about the aim being to have a patient or keep a patient for as little time as possible on the ward. You mentioned issues with accommodation, for example, within your statement. Is it ever appropriate, do you consider, to discharge a patient prior to having settled arrangements as to their accommodation? Because your statement at paragraphs 310 to 311 suggests that adults may be discharged where accommodation is not finalised.
So there are patients detained, Section 3, where there is a statutory responsibility under Section 117 to provide aftercare and make those arrangements. Patients who are admitted informally, I would say every effort would be made to identify accommodation. But if a patient is being kept on the ward and that stay on the ward is being detrimental, there are alternative arrangements occasionally made. They would liaise with the patients and families if are they willing to stay with the family member, or some temporary arrangements can be made till a more permanent solution can be found. Keeping patients on the ward for a long period also has its disadvantages.
That leads me perhaps to the notice of discharge, the 48-hour notice period. This inquiry has heard accounts of people who have been discharged without their family being aware. If the system is working as intended, and there's no issues of patient withholding consent, does it follow that a patient support network should know at least 2 days before that their relative or loved one is being discharged?
So the 48 follow-up is different to the 48
this isn't the follow-up, this is the
discharge.
48 notice.
48 hour notice is not always possible. These discharges would be discussed during the ward reviews, and they would be patients would be informed you're likely to be discharged in next week, but there might be times when patients would say, if I am well enough now to be discharged, why do you want to keep me for 48 hours? For longer, when patients are on the ward for a long duration, yes, but when patients have had a brief admission, there's also how do you manage the pressure. The home treatment team might say, as an early discharge, we're happy to look after the patient now, and if the patient agrees, the family agrees, we would go for an early discharge with rest of the treatment being provided in the community through the home treatment team. So home treatment team also has a function of early discharge, facilitating early discharge, which means that patients could be discharged. And it's long patients who've been on for a longer period and who are on section, they would be a 117 pre-discharge meeting. A date would be agreed, but for briefer admissions, following a clinical review, the patient may agree or the team may agree for a discharge.
You've already mentioned the follow-up. Let me ask you about that. At paragraph 324 of your statement, you say EPUT participate in the initial NHSE pilot, which set the 48-hour post-discharge target. And as such, EPUT have maintained the ambition for post-discharge follow-up to be completed within 48 hours. And you explain that that period starts at midnight on the day of discharge. Some specific questions, if I may. When was the pilot implemented?
So can you take me to the panel?
It's
please?
324.
So the target is a 72-hour target, and there was some specific guidance that came out nationally that for those patients who were admitted following episode of self-harm or were at risk, they should be followed earlier 48 hours. EPUT implemented that for all the patients, irrespective of whether they were admitted following self-harm or admitted following a risk to themselves. And that has been continued since then.
So my question was when?
Hard for me to remember the exact date, but it has been there for a few years.
You say that EPUT have maintained the ambition. So what is the status then of the ambition and the 48-hour target since the pilot has come to an end?
So we monitor the 48 hours rather than the 72 hours.
I'd like to move now, before we end, to some further questions about involvement of the patient and the patient's support network. We've touched on it as we've gone through, but I just want to focus on one or two matters. We, just by way of reference, I'm not going to ask that they be put up. Paragraph 47, we've looked at how information is shared with the patient and where appropriate they're chosen carers, and that's the information on arrival on the ward, and we'll come to the carer support leaflet in a moment. In paragraph 51, you talk about welcome information being made available to patients and their carers, and paragraph 70, when you are dealing with action, certainly then that needs to be agreed by the MDT, that the information must be conveyed to the patient and, where possible, appropriate relatives and carers. And I think you agreed yesterday that whilst a patient might not consent for their family and carers to receive information, turning onto the other side, that doesn't stop the family sharing information about the patient.
That's correct.
And that it's key. I think we've touched on a number of areas where it's almost always key to take information from families.
Absolutely.
How are families made aware that they may share information that will assist the patient's care? How are they encouraged?
The families are invited to the ward rounds. And now we also have family support workers who liaise with the family. But it's been a standard practice to invite family members to ward rounds. Can I just, on my earlier statement, Chair, I'm confident that 7-day follow-up is monitored by the organization. 48 hours, to the best of my understanding, is monitored, but I cannot, with full assurance, say that that is the case.
Can I ask, please, that we put up your MK12, which is at 9094 of the main bundle, or in the internal PDF numberings, I think it is 848. Thank you. So this is the carer support guide, and we'll look at some of what it says in a moment. How long have carers been provided with the leaflet or a leaflet like the one we have at MK12?
I'm not sure about the leaflet, but carers assessment has been part of the mental health services for a long time, particularly in community. There was a drive many years ago to increase the number of carers assessment offered to the carers. and most of the organizations prioritize and that was being monitored of how many carers assessments have been offered to the carers in regarding to the specific leaflet and document. I am not certain.
Let me, to be clear, we can look at it in a minute. The production date of this leaflet says it's December 2024, so this is obviously a very recent version. It's on the very final page, which we can look at in a moment.
Bottom right-hand corner, it says 27/1/2025.
Which maybe when it was printed out, I don't know. But do you know why that would be? So if actually, I haven't got it up, but Amanda, if perhaps you would forgive me, if we could go to 852 internally. I think I was looking there at the bottom, Dr. Carley, do you say it says production 2024? So maybe it was then distributed or printed shortly thereafter, Chair. But that is just an assumption on my part. Can we just have a look at what it says, please, about carers' rights and involvement, especially at discharge? Amanda, sorry, could we go back to 849 internally, please? Just to summarise, it's for the most part, it's a document signposting where carers can find support and what their rights are. And it lists, as we can see, lots of organisations that can support carers and who would be, classed as a carer. But if we look at the bottom right-hand side, we see from discharge from hospital, there's some very specific information. When a person is admitted to a mental health hospital, sure if it may be a bit small, but I'll read it. It's in the bottom right-hand corner, but maybe of that page. I'll carry on reading it, and it may be that it can. When a person is admitted to a mental health hospital, the engagement and active participation of the person and their carers is central to the delivery of care and the planning of a successful discharge.
That's correct.
So it's the bottom right-hand corner, but I'll carry on reading. It's a difficult format, this document. Patients and their carers must be kept fully informed by the allocated key worker, you've told us about the key worker, within the hospital, who will work together with the multidisciplinary team to develop and agree an appropriate care plan, taking into account the needs of the patient and their carers' wishes. So it's very, very much elevating there the input from the carer. I don't think I will be popular, but can we go to the following page and look at the top left-hand side in relation to discharge? It says discharge planning is a continuous process which should begin at the point of admission, ensuring that the patients and their carers understand and are able to participate in care decisions. Again, this is a leaflet for carers. The hospital discharge process must not put the patient or their carer at risk of harm, and must not create a situation whereby the independence of the carer or the sustainability of their caring role is jeopardised. Carers should be involved in decision-making from the beginning, and those involved in coordinating a discharge should not assume that a carer will necessarily be able or willing to continue in a caring role.
That's correct.
Although patients in general have no right to remain in hospital when their medical needs no longer deem this necessary, their carers cannot be compelled to provide care in order to facilitate a discharge. So correct. That leaflet, albeit very new, emphasises the importance, doesn't it, of not only of the involvement of the carer, but understanding the reality of the carer's position should a patient be discharged.
That's a common practice. It's not uncommon for patients who've had difficult relationships with the families, for either the patient refusing to go back or the family saying that better alternative arrangements need to be made.
Was there any trust-specific guidance or protocol in place in the relevant period about the communication or how communication should be undertaken or how families or carers should be engaged?
I think it was a common practice to invite family members for ward reviews and ward rounds, and it is understood that one cannot compel or force anyone to take anyone or look after them, and it is the responsibility of the discharging unit to ensure that patient safely discharged to a particular place.
When a patient has consented to sharing of information, so that is perhaps a more straightforward position, is it expected practice that they should be involved in any review of the patient's level observations and their views accounted for? And we looked at the observations, you'll recall, before lunch, where it said that carers should be consulted.
So there are cases, and there was a case that was brought to the quality committee where there's a prior planning where the family's been involved. Should the patient deteriorate, that this should be the plan. But many a time the reality is that it is very difficult when a decision has to be made to increase the escalation observation levels or to seclude a patient, that immediately the family can be contacted prior to the incident. There'd be expectation that we've dealt with the situation on the ward and then contacted the family.
On a similar note, when things go wrong, what policies were in place in relation to informing patients' nearest relatives or significant others about serious untoward incidents concerning the patient?
There's a duty of candor policy. There is a professional duty of candor, and there is a obligatory or legal duty of candor. When some serious incidents occur, the serious incident team will offer a formal statutory will fulfill the statutory responsibility, but it's also incumbent on the professions under their professional bodies to be open and honest under the duty of candor. So there is in short, there's a policy for that.
There is a policy for Madrid. Did staff receive any training about how to communicate these types of incidents with relatives and loved ones?
Training on duty of candor, we'll probably have to get that information from training department.
Perhaps the question...
It's not a formal training, I would say. It's not on our training register. I'm not aware of. There's any formal duty of candor training.
Perhaps I should make it clearer, not necessarily training impressing upon them that they must be open and honest, but training on how to communicate sensitively what is likely to be very bad or unfortunate, bad in the most tragic circumstances, or in other circumstances, very difficult news.
So when such incidents occur, there's a family liaison officer or is appointed, and these family liaison officers are trained in sharing that information with the families. I'm not entirely sure about the professionals, whether there is such training for them.
Sorry to go back to discharge, but just in terms of the crisis plan, you acknowledge that was key at discharge. Do you agree that carers or families should be involved in the development of the crisis plan, particularly as they're named, they may have been identified as the persons who will support in terms of crisis?
If they are involved in supporting, yes, they should be involved in.
I think at the paragraph 301, you actually use the word co-producing in relation to the discharge plan.
That's correct.
And that's what it should be, should it?
That's what it should be, where possible.
There are, I anticipate, circumstances where a chosen carer raises concerns or objections to a discharge plan. What's the process in those circumstances?
One would expect the treating team to meet with the family and listen to their concerns and try to address their concerns. There could be a disparity in expectations as well, where the treating team might feel that they have medically optimized the patient and the patient is ready to discharge. But the family may disagree and be concerned. And it's the question of how do we address those concerns? How do you reassure the family and reassure the team themselves that the discharge is a safe discharge? There could be difference of opinion between the families and the treating team.
do you acknowledge, or does EPUT acknowledge, I should say, that concerns have been raised by coroners and in inquests about the fact that views of carers were either not being listened to or being ignored?
I'm aware of it, and probably the appointment of the family support workers is one of the initiatives to address the concerns that were raised around the involvement of family.
Finally, this from me, and I'm referring to your paragraph 288. You say, and you refer to EPUT introducing the International Fundamentals of Care framework, which you've referred to and given your evidence, and you've provided a slideshow about it. You say, which emphasises the importance of nurses and other healthcare professionals developing trusting therapeutic relationships with patients, their families and carers. It also emphasises patients' psychosocial needs. Would you say that there were aspects of that care that were missing previously?
The nursing care become task-oriented, so whether the news has been done or whether this particular task has been completed, and how do we ensure that the nurse or any staff member fully understands the patient, is aware of the history, and not just the task that's been allocated to that nurse or a staff member for that day. And the whole fundamentals of care is about taking that pride back in nursing and knowing the patient, rather than just being there on that day to perform the tasks that have been allocated to you.
Dr. Corrali, that's all I have to ask you, unless, Chair, you have any questions at this time.
I just want to ask one quick one
Yes.
about what you've just said about the fundamentals of care and the need to establish again
Therapeutic relationship.
a therapeutic relationship. Is that something that you think that the healthcare support worker is able to do as well as the registered nurse?
Absolutely. The only difference is healthcare support workers may not have a good understanding of the psychiatric presentation, where you would expect the qualified nurse to have a better understanding of the clinical presentations, but healthcare support workers should also be part of that building therapeutic relationship with the patient.
And is that something that a healthcare support worker will be trained to do?
They should be trained too. This is a rollout of this program. They're starting with the nursing team. I take your point, Chair, about the importance of getting the support workers trained in the fundamentals of care.
And that has not yet happened, but it will happen.
I'm not certain about it. It's a program that's being led by a chief nurse, so I'm not very close to the program.
Thank you.
May I suggest a 10-minute break to
Yes.
see if anything else arises? And
Yes.
we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you, Chair.
10 minutes. Ms. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. There are just a few additional questions, Dr. Corrali, and by the nature of them, we may jump around a little bit. In relation to bed management, you gave evidence that the Trust uses a tool called Smart Tool to say how many patients are waiting in the community. Can data for the relevant period be captured via that tool? And if so, would it be data that could be provided to the inquiry?
Yes. The summary is provided to the executive team on a weekly basis. So either that or the information from the tool itself could be provided.
Can I ask you a little bit about neurodiversity training? You will recall I asked you about what part 2 of the Oliver McGowan training comprises. You told us it was a one-day face-to-face session. Have you yourself undertaken that training?
I'm due in June, so we've been allocated dates because of the timing. So I have a date that's been allocated to me to undertake that training, which is in June this year.
Because I think you told us yesterday you still do one clinical session a week, is that
That's right, yeah. So I've done my part one, my one training, and I'm due for my level 2.
When dealing with the question of reasonable adjustments for patients with neurodivergent conditions earlier, you referred to the fact that aids might be provided, such as headphones to assist with noise in the ward. Are aids such as that offered to all patients experiencing difficulties, or only patients who require them or ask for them for reasonable adjustments?
I would say it's on a needs basis. So if a patient does require something to calm the environment down, that would be provided.
I think the question really is, do you offer them or do you wait to be asked?
It would be part of the care, rather than being asked. It would be part of their treatment plan or care plan.
Can I ask you about what have been described as drug-induced behaviours and those which are unconnected but complicate the presentation? Do practices differ between staff when distinguishing between drug-induced behaviours and different behaviours that are unconnected but complicate the position?
No, I think the drug-induced psychosis is a term where now it is seen as the use of drugs has precipitated a psychotic illness. So the psychotic illness episode still needs to be treated as any other psychotic illness. The challenges subsequently are the work undertaken to reduce the likelihood of that patient going back to the use of drugs.
Do staff follow any clinical guidance and best practice in that task?
There are nice guidelines on management of psychosis.
Yes,
So-
I think you attached them to your statement in
Yes.
fact. Is that your answer? That's...
Yes.
And how is this position impacted by the evidence you gave earlier that most drug and alcohol services are now delivered by third sector organisations?
So that doesn't involve the acute treatment, the detoxifications, or the treatment of the secondary complications, or mental illnesses resulting from use of alcohol. What I meant was around long-term abstinence, motivation, harm minimization. Those are provided. It has impacted. It was easier when you had a single organization providing both aspects of care. But mental health services have moved from there.
Is there a risk that the presentations or the two presentations are misdiagnosed?
No, they're two different. So acute condition, mental illness, and acute conditions would be treated. The drug and alcohol services are unlikely to treat acute mental illness. There used to be what is called as dual diagnosis services at one stage, where they would look after patients who had mental illness and substance misuse. But now the mental illness aspect is looked after by the mental health services, especially during an acute episode, and the long-term management of harm minimization and abstinence from alcohol and drugs is managed by the drug and alcohol services in the community.
Can I ask questions about the sexual safety and staffing? You said it would be difficult to staff female wards with female staff used to recruit. Are patients always searched by members of the same sex?
Patient, yes.
Can you clarify what you meant? You gave evidence that there was no science behind the date of discharge and that this is something to focus the mind of the patient. What did you mean? Focus the mind of the staff?
Staff, because what you want to do as staff member is to not keep the patient longer than that's required. And if the tasks can be done today, and that's the whole concept of red and green days and an expected date of discharge, that let's not delay the treatment. The expected date of discharge is 4 weeks. These are the tasks we need to complete within 4 weeks to get the patient ready for discharge. Rather than a patient's admitted on the ward, let's continue the treatment no matter how long it's going to take, and then start thinking about where the patient gets discharged to. So it's as I mentioned, it's easier for briefer admissions For more complex patients, it's difficult to establish the date of discharge at the time, but that's reviewed regularly.
The inquiry is aware of situations in which voluntary patients have discharged themselves from inpatient wards, apparently against medical advice. When the patient self-discharges against medical advice, should a discharge plan, including the crisis plan to which we've referred, nonetheless be implemented?
Absolutely.
And should that include urgent consideration, given the circumstances, and incorporation of any carers' views?
When a patient is discharging against medical advice, it would be slightly different when a planned discharge where you're inviting the family members. The aspect of communicating family where possible also should the discharge against medical advice should not be treated different to discharge with patients with medical as a planned discharge. So the patient will have the medications, will have a discharge summary, GP will be informed all the aspects of the aftercare arrangements, and the aftercare treatment should be offered as they are offered to any other patient.
But my question was around consideration of carers' views, particularly if a patient has taken themselves out of the inpatient facility.
If a patient at 8 o'clock in the evening says, I want to leave the ward, and I'm not even willing to wait for you, and that's how you manage the situation. You would, if the patient is amenable for the junior doctor to come and talk to the patient, get involved with the family, yes, that should be the practice. If the patient is at risk, then the option is for staff to consider whether holding the patient under the powers of the Mental Health Act are applicable. But otherwise, if the patient wants to leave, it's very difficult to stop an informal patient if there are no risks. And then you would then liaise with, follow the formal process.
For the discharge plan and crisis plan?
That's true.
Do you have, or does EPUT, have any policy or procedures in place to manage discharge against medical advice? There are guidance for discharging against medical advice. If it is not a policy in itself, I'm aware that it's included in some parts of the policy, component of the policy. But there is guidance on discharging against medical advice and what needs to happen. And that is no doubt something we could add to the list of things that
Absolutely.
You will provide to the inquiry. In terms of accommodation, when a person is discharged, in terms of a person that has been detained under the Mental Health Act, is it your understanding that responsibility for suitable care and accommodation in those cases lies with the local authority?
Yeah, under Section 117 of aftercare arrangements, yes.
But that, the questions I asked earlier were in relation to inform. That is a patient that was detained under section, is that right?
That's correct.
In respect of information relied on for the purposes of pre-admission assessment, to what extent should that include multi-agency information gatherings, such as information from primary healthcare services, police, criminal justice services, where the patient has been open to those services?
So for the assessments under the Mental Health Act, the AMP would usually do that. It is quite clear in the code of practice to gather information from wherever it's possible.
What about informal?
And informal, based on the availability of the information and the person undertaking that assessment. If the assessment is undertaken is taking place at home with the crisis response service, they would talk to the family. You'd expect them to talk to the family. GP information, how easy is it to contact general practitioners? The information through the portal is available, the primary care information is available. So the idea is that before seeing a patient, one should gather as much information as possible from as many sources available, through its carers, through the residential care, the placements the patients are staying, or others involved in the care.
In terms of mixed-sex wards, on a mixed-sex ward, what measures or safeguards are in place to ensure that patients remained within their allocated area? And in relation to that, are staff trained or expected to have recourse to restrictive practices if one patient attempts to enter the opposite sex wing?
So I'm not entirely clear.
Sorry, we've dealt with mixed-sex wards.
That's correct, yeah.
So I asked two questions together. I thought they may link, but forgive me if they don't. First of all, what measures or safeguards are in place to stop mixing in a mixed-sex ward? You've talked about the separate areas, the separate wings. You've described that to us. So first of all, what is done to prevent that? And if a member of one sex tries to enter the other wing, so to speak, are staff trained or expected to have recourse to restrictive practices to prevent that happening?
Yes, it will depend on the clinical presentation. If it is safe to then treat that. If someone is entering a female because he's very unwell and he's manic, then it needs to be addressed in that particular way of treating his condition. It may not necessarily require restraining but staff would stop the patient from entering the female-only area.
Can I just go back to care plans and to the extent to which inpatient care plans identify and support social and economic determinants of mental health, given their relevance? Would it be expected that the nurse responsible for an inpatient's care plan would liaise with other agencies involved in a patient's community care to formulate relevant care plans?
Where possible, the nurse should.
And who is responsible in accordance with national or local trust policy for the ownership of the inpatient care plan? I asked you about who was responsible for it. Is it the named nurse or another member of the MDT?
The named nurse is responsible for drafting and writing the care plan. It's an MDT response. It's a responsibility shared by the multidisciplinary team.
So there's no single individual who's in charge of it?
The ward manager and the matron have an overall responsibility of day-to-day running and the care planning on the wards.
Are family members recognised as part of the MDT, similar to a comparative model in adult social care, for example? You've told us they're invited to attend. Are they considered part of the team?
You said they would attend the ward round, not the MDT.
They would attend the ward round.
I thought they said that you were invited. It's my fault. I'd also understood. Were they invited to attend the MDT or not?
No, not the MDT. The ward rounds, and to meet with the consultant or the team separately.
Are they considered part of the MDT even if not invited to attend the meetings?
They're partners. I mean, it's both the treating team and the family have the same aims to get the patient well. And treat the patient. So they're very much part of the team. The responsibilities are different. I think when a patient is on the ward, it's the responsibility of the ward and the treating team. It would be unfair to expect that, it's saying that they're part of the team and they've given handing over that responsibility to the ward to look after the patient.
Thank you, Jane. And finally what is the relationship or expected relationship between the discharge coordinator and the care coordinator in respect of the discharge planning?
The care coordinator is a member of the community mental health team who's been involved in the care of that patient in the community. Discharge and discharge coordinators are members of the inpatient team looking at the obstacles for discharge and assisting the team in ensuring that discharge takes place in a timely manner. I think the responsibilities of the care coordinator are wider, more clinical, and most of the care coordinators are clinicians who have better understanding of the mental health services.
Chair, that's all the questions, unless you have any further questions.
I have no more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Dr. Riley, thank you very much indeed.
Chair, I think we will move now to hearing some summaries of evidence. That's just going to involve a change of personnel here.
Pat.
And there, yes. And so
Am I?
Dr. Crowley, I think,
And
can be
you-
released from his own.
Thank you, Chair. Thank
Stand
you.
down. Thank you very much. Amber.
Amber.
Aye. I think you can stop. She'll bring up my statements for you. After you.
Chair, thank you very much. Another member of the Council to the Inquiry team, Anna Draper, will now present some summaries of evidence that the inquiry has received so far, as I indicated this morning, from other organisations. And so I will hand over to Ms Draper now to present those summaries and, I believe, put up some relevant exhibits relating to them.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Draper, thank you.
This is a summary of the evidence provided to the inquiry by the Department of Health and Social Care, otherwise referred to as the DHSE. That evidence has already been disclosed to call participants, and it should be noted that this summary will not cover the totality of the evidence provided. The first heading is background and role. The evidence submitted to the inquiry on behalf of the DHSE thus far is in the form of a written statement signed by William Vinall, Director of NHS Quality, Safety and Investigations, and dated the 24th of March 2025. For those following the documentation, that statement begins at page 370 in the call bundle. I should also say that the relevant exhibits I won't name individually in the summary, but they were disclosed to call participants as part of the April hearings exhibit bundle, and will be published on the website, as I understand, in due course. With his statement, then, Mr. Vinall disclosed a number of exhibits. The DHSE, known as the Department of Health until 2018, is responsible for key functions in respect of the health service. Those functions include securing resources for the National Health Service, the NHS, overseeing and, where necessary, seeking to amend the legislative framework for the NHS, representing the views and interests of the NHS within government, developing and supporting strategy and policy, and being accountable to Parliament for the NHS. The DHSE's role is to support and advise the government's health and social care ministers, and it oversees three main functions to that end: the NHS, public health, and adult social care. It is responsible for overall health policy, whilst NHS England, NHSE, has day-to-day responsibility for the NHS and for arranging and securing the provision of services through, as of 1st of July 2022, through integrated care boards, otherwise known as ICBs. Neither the Secretary of State nor the DHSE are responsible for directly commissioning NHS services. The DHSE supports the Secretary of State in the discharge of their duties. The Secretary of State has powers of intervention to deal with cases of persistent failure until those were repealed in 2007. The National Health Service Act 2006 placed a duty on the Secretary to promote a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of people in England and in the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of physical and mental illness. The Health and Social Care Act 2012 made significant amendments to the 2006 Act and gave effect to a wide range of structural changes to the NHS. One example is that primary care trusts, PCTs, and strategic health authorities were abolished, and commissioning responsibilities were passed to a newly created NHS Commissioning Board, which would later become known as NHSE. And separately to that, there were clinical commissioning groups, also known as CCGs. The Act made clear that the Secretary of State's responsibility lay primarily in ensuring that the functions of commissioning services and the provision of services were being carried out effectively. The changes established a more rules-based system, with NHS bodies' day-to-day operations being more clearly separated from the strategic role of ministers. With the 2012 Act, the Secretary of State was required to publish and lay before Parliament a mandate to set strategic direction, and the content was subject to government agreement, and any objectives were reflected in NHSE operational guidance. Those for the relevant years are exhibited in DHSE's statement. The DHSE prioritises building strong and effective working relationships with each of its arm's length bodies, as they're referred to, ALBs, or public bodies via sponsor teams. These teams work collaboratively to ensure accountable, efficient and effective healthcare services. NHS Improvement, NHSI, was a key ALB, arm's length body, that operated during the relevant period. It was established on the 1st of April 2016 and merged with NHSE following the passage of the Health and Care Act 2022, although it was working together with NHSE from the 1st of April 2019 as a single organisation. DHSE's role in respect of NHSI was to scrutinise its strategy, performance and delivery. The DHSE has provided to the inquiry an internal guide that was prepared for departmental staff, which sets out the roles and responsibilities of NHSI and how the department held it to account during the time it was in operation. The framework agreement between the department and NHSI that was published in 2018 has also been supplied in the exhibits. NHSI brought together Monitor, the NHS Trust Development Agency, Patient Safety, the National Reporting and Learning System, the Advancing Change Team and Intensive Support Teams. Prior to this, on the 9th of March 2016, Monitor and the NHS Trust Development Authority published a Learning from Mistakes League to encourage openness and transparency in the NHS. If I could ask that that's put up on screen, please. This league table scored providers based on factors including near misses and incidents and the fairness and effectiveness of procedures for reporting errors. Thank you, that could be taken down. Essex NHS trusts featured in that table. The South Essex Partnership University NHS Foundation Trust was ranked 20th out of 230 trusts. The Mid-Essex Hospital Services NHS Trust was 189th, and the North Essex Partnership University NHS Trust was 218th. Supporting data from the 2015 NHS Staff Survey and National Reporting and Learning System was published alongside the table. As of 2025 then, the DHSE is expected to publish a framework document outlining its relationship with each ALB, the governance and accountability arrangements, a remit or chair's letter outlining key areas for the ALBs to focus on each year, this being mandated from either the Secretary of State for the NHSE and to hold regular meetings with its ALBs. The department works closely with a range of other organisations, including government departments on mental health services and inpatient safety matters, and these organisations include, but are not limited to, Bipolar UK, the British Psychological Society, Inquest, Mind, the National Institute for Mental Health, the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, and the Zero Suicide Alliance. Involvement with mental health services then. The DHSE had an active policy agenda in relation to mental health during the relevant period, which included the establishment and rollout of interventions such as talking therapies, early intervention in psychosis services, shifting care from hospital to the community, reforms to the Mental Health Act, improving crisis care access, mental health support in schools, and suicide prevention. The Mental Health Act 1983 sets the legal framework to authorise detention and compulsory treatment of people with a mental health disorder. It's supported by a code of practice. Revisions have recently been proposed and are currently under consideration before Parliament. The Department notes for context the NHS White Paper published in 1988 and the National Service Framework for Mental Health published in 1999. Mention is also made of another publication, a first-class service. That explained how NHS standards would be set by NICE and National Service Frameworks, NSFs, delivered by clinical governance and monitored by the Commission for Health Improvement, amongst other things. NSFs were intended to improve the quality and consistency of healthcare by setting national standards for specific areas of health and social care, identifying key interventions and establishing strategies to tackle variations in access and service delivery across the country. The first NSF, published in 1999, set out 7 standards the NHS were expected to meet for mental health, including access to services and suicide prevention. The aims and standards were reflected in wider policies issued by the DHSE, for example, the Health Services Circular, one of the included exhibits. The NHS plan, A Plan for Investment, A Plan for Reform, in 2000 set out overall priorities and commitments for the NHS, and it was intended to be a long-term vision for the NHS and to set national priorities, of which mental health was one. The first National Suicide Prevention Strategy for England was published in 2002. This supported the white paper Saving Lives, Our Healthier Nation, published by the Department in 1999, which was a government plan focused on the main killers, which included mental illness. The target was to reduce death rate from suicides by at least 20% by 2010. The National Institute of Mental Health in England oversaw the implementation of that strategy. In 2011, the No Health Without Mental Health, a cross-government mental health outcomes strategy for people of all ages, was published. The strategy asserted that the quality of mental health care had improved in recent years, but that more emphasis had to be placed on structures and processes rather than outcomes. The DHSE worked with several partner organisations to agree 6 shared objectives and 6 shared outcome indicators. The outcomes related to prevention, treatment and recovery, physical health, positive experience of care, and reducing avoidable harm. A new 10-year National Suicide Prevention Strategy for England was then published in 2012, and it addressed new challenges and concerns and identified inpatients as a priority group for action. In 2014, the DHSE then published Closing the Gap, Priorities for Essential Change in Mental Health. This set out shorter-term priorities to achieve the longer-term vision. Its goals included increased access to service and improving the life of those with mental ill health. Achieving better access to mental health services by 2020 was also published in 2014. That was by both the DHSE and NHSE. It detailed 3 phases to change mental health services, including increasing capacity and introducing waiting time standards to improve access, and aimed to achieve parity between physical and mental health services. The DHSE and NHSE jointly published Future in Mind the following year in 2015, which emphasised the NHS, public health, local authorities and other organisations working together to build resilience, promoting good mental health and prevention, early intervention and other things. The aim was for commissioners to make better decisions about what inpatient capacity was needed. In 2016, NHSE commissioned the paper implementing the 5-year forward view for mental health. This set out an implementation programme to deliver recommendations from a mental health task force and a number of key commitments. Then in 2018, the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act was introduced with the aim of reducing unnecessary and inappropriate use of restraint in mental health hospitals. And in 2019, the NHS long-term plan set out 10-year priorities for the NHS. The plan included priorities for inpatient mental health settings, including eliminating inappropriate out-of-area placements, reducing the average length of stay, and reducing suicides for mental health inpatients. Also in 2019 was the publication of the NHS Mental Health Implementation Plan, which detailed plans for delivering the remaining commitments under the 5-year forward view and how these would be built on to deliver those targets under the NHS long-term plan. The COVID-19 Mental Health and Wellbeing Recovery Action Plan in 2021 outlined the government's plans to mitigate and respond to the mental health impact of the pandemic, and it aimed to provide additional funding to keep the long-term plan and Mental Health Act reforms on track. In 2023, NHSE launched the Mental Health, Learning Disability and Autism Inpatient Quality Transformation Programme to support cultural change across inpatient services. The DHSE then published another paper titled Major Conditions Strategy, Case for Change and Our Strategic Framework, identifying 6 key groups of conditions contributing to ill health, one of which was mental ill health. An additional paper then, in 2023, was the Suicide Prevention Strategy for England, which replaced the 2012 strategy and set out priority areas for action, including the need for effective crisis support to reduce suicide specifically. Finally, in 2024, the Mental Health Bill was introduced. After an independent review into the Mental Health Act, the government published a white paper reforming the Mental Health Act, which accepted most of the review's recommendations. The bill is now undergoing parliamentary scrutiny. There are several relevant policies cited by the DHSE. The first on reducing inappropriate out-of-area placements, which was introduced as early as 1999 and remained a core aim in the 2019 NHS long-term plan. The plan set out aims to eliminate out-of-area placements by 2023-24. Although this was not achieved, the DHSE states due to factors such as the pandemic and difficulties in patient flow through the system. The aim was accompanied by a recognition that spending more time in hospital did not necessarily lead to better outcomes for patients. There was a policy on ensuring timely follow-up after someone is discharged from inpatient facilities. The standard expectation was that patients would receive follow-up support within 7 days. The aim was then for inpatients to receive a follow-up within 72 hours of discharge. This was abandoned when NHSE stopped publishing data on this metric in April 2021. A policy on assessing the physical environment to remove means of suicide was introduced in 1999. Removal of ligature points was also identified in the 2002 Suicide Prevention Strategy and in multiple policy documents published since. There was a 35% fall in the number of inpatient suicides between 2010 and 2020, and improvements on this number remains a key aim for the department. As to policies around risk management for suicide and self-harm, the focus during the first part of the relevant period was on staff training for risk management and suicide being updated every 3 years. Later policy documents from the DHSE and NHSE encourage compliance with NICE guidelines on risk formulation and management. The 2023 National Prevention Strategy notes that trusts and providers should go further to identify and implement actions to prevent suicides in inpatient settings. The department issued a policy around ensuring that patients, carers and families are included in decision-making, planning and information sharing. To that end, the 12 points to a safer service guidance set out in the 5-year report of the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Homicide by People with Mental Illness emphasised the importance of sharing information with families during reviews of suicide, as well as risk management training for staff and other factors. In 2014, the government announced that departments were expected to use the family test as part of quality assessment of services, and that carers should be closely involved in decisions about service provision. The co-production of services with people with lived experience, their families and carers, was emphasised further in the 5-year forward view and the associated implementation plan. The principle of providing therapeutic care in the least restrictive environment is consistent throughout many policies in the relevant period, from the NHS plan in 2000 to government announcements in 2020 detailing investment in greater privacy in mental health facilities. There have been policies on improving access to services and reducing wait times and on crisis care. As to improving access, there was a commitment to increasing the number of beds in the implementation plan for the 5-year forward view, for example. On crisis care, there was a focus on liaison teams in A&E, supporting people with mental illness to reduce inappropriate hospital care and out-of-area placements. The long-term plan set out an intention for mental health liaison services to be available in all acute hospital A&E departments and inpatient wards in 2023 to 24. Finally, there have been policies on addressing inequality, stigma, and encouraging a culture of care. A national inequalities target was first introduced in 2000 to reinforce local targets for reducing inequality. In 2018, the independent review of the Mental Health Act highlighted racial disparities in the rate of detention. Within this policy, it's noted that the government consulted on the white paper proposals issued in response to the independent review. A draft bill was also issued in 2022, and the Joint Pre-Legislative Scrutiny Committee produced a report and recommendations in March 2024. Monitoring of compliance, concerns and failings at a national level. The Secretary of State has responsibility to Parliament for the provision of the health service, and the DHSE is responsible for the health and care legislative framework. Most operational management in the NHS, including mental health services, takes place at arm's length from the department. The DHSE holds ARBs accountable through its sponsorship arrangements, and each ARB has a senior departmental sponsor. The department's levers include the power for the Secretary of State to appoint and remove chairs, accountability from the accounting officer of each ARB, framework agreements between the DHSE and the ARB, annual business plans and performance reporting against those plans, and a programme of reviews. The Secretary of State retains formal powers to intervene in the event of significant failure by a non-departmental public body, and as a first step, the Secretary can issue a direction to the ARB, and if the organisation fails to comply, the department may discharge the functions to which the direction relates or make arrangements for another organisation to do so. In all cases, the reasons for an intervention must be published. To safeguard the independence of regulators, ministers are prevented from intervening in specific cases dealt with by Monitor or the CQC. Ministerial powers are limited to situations of significant failure. The CQC took over responsibility for monitoring and inspecting the quality of services in 2009. The Health and Social Care Act 2008 requires the CQC to keep the Secretary of State informed about the provision of NHS healthcare services and it may intervene and issue directions. The Secretary can also carry out the functions of the CQC, or again arrange for a third party to do so if the CQC fails to comply. That power, however, has not been exercised since the creation of the CQC. At Annex E to the witness statement provided, there is a summary of investigations, independent reviews and audits commissioned by the DHSE over the relevant period. Evidence from reviews and reports commissioned by the department points to factors supportive of patient safety. There were many independent reviews, reports and inquiries, not all directly commissioned by the DHSE, which led to important learning and government action in relation to inpatient safety. One example is an organisation with a memory report commissioned to learn about the scale and nature of serious failings in the NHS and to make requisite recommendations. The report, although not specific to mental health, found that a blame culture and the lack of a national system for sharing lessons learned were key barriers to identifying and then reducing the number of patient safety incidents. It also highlighted the need for the government to act on recommendations quicker. The department then responded with building a safer NHS. This set out plans to establish the National Patient Safety Agency and a mandatory reporting scheme extending to mental health inpatient services. The report found there was a lack of clarity as to when an external investigation was required after an incident, and in 2005, the DHSE published guidance titled Independent Investigation of Adverse Events in Mental Health Services. The department learned from serious incidents and failings in care, such as the death of Olaseni Lewis, who is otherwise known as Seni, who lost his life following the disproportionate and inappropriate use of force in a mental health unit. A private member's bill titled Seni's Law was introduced to Parliament in 2017 and aimed to reduce the use of restraint in hospitals. It received royal assent in 2018 as the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act that I've already referred to. Accompanying statutory guidance was published after public consultation. After a series of high-profile patient safety incidents and abuse of patients, the DHSE commissioned a rapid review into mental health inpatient safety in 2023. The review recommended that the DHSE and the NHS needed to ensure that the most important and impactful metrics were being measured regarding mental health patient safety and therapeutic care. In March 2024, the department published the government's response to the rapid review and set up a steering group and a mortality working group to act on the recommendations. The government then commissioned the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch, otherwise referred to as HSIB, to undertake a series of national investigations into mental health inpatient services to cover 4 priority areas: how out-of-area placements are handled, supporting transition to adult inpatient settings for children and young people, creating conditions for delivery of safe and therapeutic care, and learning from deaths. In January 2025, the HSIB concluded their investigations, and the findings have been published in a series of reports available on their website and also included in the exhibits. As part of this, the decision was taken to undertake further work, the results of which are due to be published this month, May. The DHSE will be formally responding to all of the recommendations in due course. Action has been taken at a national level and progress made, one example being the reduction in the use of police cells as a place of safety for people in mental health crisis, including as a result of collaboration between the DHSE, police, health and mental health charities as part of the Mental Health Crisis Care Concordant. Another example is the action recommended by the independent review of the Mental Health Act to replace dormitory accommodation on inpatient wards, and 43 projects have been completed to this end. Finally, the DHSE notes that it remains the case that too many people experience poor quality care and lose their lives in inpatient mental health settings. HSIVs report mental health inpatient settings, creating conditions for learning from deaths in mental health inpatient services, and when patients die within 30 days of discharge, includes a diagram. If I could ask, please, that's put up at page 5951. This diagram details the flow of accountability from Parliament all the way down to patients and the public at the bottom. The HSIV report underlines that the DHSE and others could do more to learn from deaths and or the issues identified in their reviews. Thank you, Amanda, that can come down. Chair, that is the summary of the evidence from DHSE. I wonder if that might be an appropriate time to take a short break.
Do you want me to leave or shall we just change? What would you like to do?
I think a short 10-minute break.
10-minute break.
Going for about
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. 10 minutes. Thank you. Straight back.
The next summary is of the evidence provided to the inquiry by NHS England. Again, this summary will not cover the totality of the information provided. Firstly, as to its role, the evidence submitted on behalf of NHSE on its role was provided in a statement by Duncan Burton, Chief Nursing Officer, dated the 24th of March 2025. That statement is at page 458 of the core bundle. NHSE is a system of commissioners, regulators and providers, each with distinct roles. It is an executive non-departmental public body of the DHSE. Since its establishment in 2013, it has been the commissioner of certain specialised mental health services, the statutory regulator of local commissioners and trusts. It has an overall leadership role and also a patient safety role. It was formerly the NHS Commissioning Board for England, and during the relevant period there was a significant legislative reform which led to NHS regulatory bodies coming together. The first change was NHS Improvement in 2016, which combined Monitor and the NHS Trust Development Authority. They were regulators of the foundation trusts and trusts, respectively. NHSI and NHSE came together in 2019, formally merging in 2022. NHSE also merged with NHS Digital in February 2023 and with Health Education England in April 2023. Commissioning is defined as the role of planning and securing the provision of healthcare services. It involves an ongoing process of assessment, planning, agreement and monitoring to ensure services are provided and delivered to the required standard. Commissioning responsibility falls to NHSE for specialised services and to ICBs, the Integrated Care Boards, for non-specialised services. Patients receive their care from providers who have an arrangement to deliver services with one or more commissioners. The providers are accountable to commissioners through their contracts, and it is their responsibility to ensure services are carried out in accordance with specifications, in line with clinical guidance and nationally determined healthcare standards. The providers employ their own staff and procure their own supplies. NHSE exercises an appointment role in relation to certain senior roles within the trusts, but aside from that, none of the staff are employed or managed by NHSE. NHSE's core legal function and purpose is to promote a comprehensive health service to secure improvement in physical and mental health and the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of physical and mental illness. It also has a role in respect of oversight of local commissioners and providers, and the NHS works with the DHSE to contribute to the development of policy and to support the government in understanding the implications of their policies. To that end, NHSE engages with other people and organisations as necessary, including service users. The department is governed by its own board, which provides leadership and accountability. It has regional teams responsible for the performance of all NHS organisations, overseeing interactions with clinical commissioning groups, CCGs, and for commissioning functions in the region. Each regional team is led by the regional director, who is part of the NHSE executive. In relation to mental health services then, each region provides the functions of strategic, quality and patient safety oversight and policy implementation. The regional medical director and chief nurse are responsible for leading regional quality teams and ensuring robust clinical governance and quality assurance. They chair the Regional Quality Committee, which oversees quality improvement and patient safety, including the reviewing of serious incidents. Regional teams also participate in ICB executive quality groups. For ICB level failures, they assess the implications and support the providers. In addition, if a provider receives a CQC warning notice, the regional team supports them in implementing the relevant guidance. For any providers in a recovery support programme, which was formerly the Special Measures Programme, they support the central NHSE team in managing recovering providers. In its role as Commissioner, the NHSE enters contracts with independent and NHS providers, and from 2013 it had statutory responsibility for commissioning primary care services, prescribed specialised services, including for mental health, certain military and veteran health services, services supporting children and adults throughout the criminal justice system, and a limited number of public health services. They directly commissioned mental health services that included Adult Secure, Children and Young People, Specialist Autism Spectrum Disorder, Adult Eating Disorder, and OCD and Body Dysmorphic Disorder services. Specialised services commissioned by NHSE are grouped into 6 national programmes of care, one of which is mental health. The programmes work primarily through a network of clinical reference groups which develop national service specifications and guidance. One of the aims of the groups is to integrate lived inpatient experience to enhance mental health services. Since 2020, NHS-led provider collaboratives have been in force, and these are groups of providers of specialised mental health, learning disability and autism services who work together to improve care pathways for their local population. The collaboratives deliver specialised services, again in children and young people's mental health, adult low and medium secure, and adult eating disorder services. Since April 2024, the ICBs in the East of England, Midlands and North West have assumed full delegated commissioning responsibility for suitable services. The CCGs, established in 2013, were responsible for planning and commissioning healthcare services within their local area and were clinically led by statutory NHS bodies. As co-commissioners, CCGs worked with the NHSE regional teams before they were replaced by ICBs in 2022. Since 2003, a trust can be an NHS trust or an NHS foundation trust. The key difference is that foundation trusts have more autonomy. Each trust is responsible for ensuring compliance with statutory and regulatory requirements for the delivery of safe, effective, efficient and high-quality services. It is also the responsibility of the provider to manage day-to-day care and the management of patients. This includes decision-making around a patient's suitability for treatment and whether a patient should be admitted. Clinical treatment decisions are made in accordance with operational policy, provider procedure, clinical guidance and subject to regulatory requirements. NHS trusts and foundation trusts are subject to legal duties around health and safety, patient safety, complaints, data protection, safeguarding in their own right. Compliance with those duties informs NHSE and CQC oversight, and legal enforcement can occur outside of this sphere, for example, through health and safety prosecutions and also judicial review. Before the introduction of Monitor with the Health and Social Care Act 2012, the foundation trusts were regulated by the Independent Regulator of Foundation Trusts, established in 2004. Monitor had a range of intervention and enforcement actions, as well as a role in supporting failing foundation trusts. It became aware of patient safety issues in a variety of ways and conducted its own assessments to decide whether a formal investigation was necessary and enforcement action appropriate. As of the 1st of April 2013, the trusts were monitored and regulated by the NHS Trust Development Authority. Mental health services are delivered by a range of professionals in multidisciplinary teams, the majority of which are also regulated by the NMC, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, GMC, or the HCPC. In 2016, NHS Improvement was created and became responsible for regulating NHS hospitals before being subsumed into NHSE in 2019. At that point, the NHSE's role didn't change, but rather the two organisations came together. It continued to be responsible for commissioning, and NHSI responsible through Monitor and the Trust Development Authority for the regulation of providers. In 2022, the NHSE and Improvement formally merged, at which point NHSE then took on the regulatory functions of Improvement. As to oversight, providers are subject to primarily registration and regulation by the CQC, contractual controls via the commissioning contract, and for foundation trusts and certain independent providers, there is also the NHS provider licence. Since the 1st of April 2023, NHS trusts have been required to hold a provider licence. The foundation trusts were expected to comply with the NHS Foundation Trust Code of Governance, which also echoed the requirements of the provider licence. The fit and proper person test applies to both organisations and individuals. In 2012 and 2014, statutory requirements imposed fit and proper persons requirements in relation to appointments to foundation trust boards. Enforcing compliance with the fit and proper person regulation was the responsibility of the CQC, although it was incorporated into the provider licence framework. Before 2016, there were separate oversight frameworks which applied to the foundation trusts and trusts, and from September that year, the single oversight framework was introduced with the aim of supporting more trusts to achieve good or outstanding ratings. When NHSE and Improvement merged, a single NHS oversight framework, which applied to commissioners and providers, was implemented. There are also primary care networks in which GP practices work together with the community, mental health, social care, pharmacy, hospital and voluntary services. The networks ensure that mental health services are closely linked to community health care and encourage a more comprehensive approach to mental health care. Involvement with providers. The NHSE operates as an arm's length body, as we've already heard, an ALB, that has a shared responsibility with similar organisations to oversee patient safety. Patient safety is part of a wider concept of quality and success in healthcare, and it means the avoidance of unintended harm and the reduction of risk of such harm to an acceptable level. It does not concern deliberate or unintended harm, as those are events concerning the police and other safeguarding bodies. NHS bodies are expected to deliver and oversee services, including those that improve patient safety, and that expectation is established through legal duties, reporting requirements, observance of clinical standards, and their commissioner requirements. Trusts make their own policies for risk management and health and safety, and they are informed by guidance from organisations such as the CQC. For example, the CQC has published guidance on reducing harm from ligatures on mental health wards. That is included as one of the exhibits. NHSE was established to deliver key statutory patient safety duties across the NHS, including collecting information about what goes wrong and using that to provide advice and guidance. These included collecting information about what goes wrong in the health service, and between 2012 and 2018, there are a number of patient safety initiatives directed by the government. The NHS Patient Safety Strategy 2019, which was updated then in 2021 and 23, was one of these and aimed at improving the way the NHS learns about patient safety, building capability to address safety challenges and focus on key improvement priorities. There are two systems which set out the expectations for the way in which the NHS should identify and manage certain patient safety incidents and serious incidents. The first is the National Framework for Reporting and Learning from Serious Incidents Requiring Investigation, and that was in place between 2010 and 2013. Secondly, the Serious Incident Framework, published first in 2013 and refreshed in 2015. A new policy was then announced when NHSE published the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework, the PSIRF, in 2022, which we've already heard about in evidence. Could I ask that we have page 6415 up, please? This is included in the exhibit titled PSIRF. The PSIRF replaced the Serious Incident Framework and is one of the main systems for developing and maintaining effective processes for responding to patient safety incidents and facilitating learning. There is an overview of the framework and associated documentation shown here. Patient safety incidents are defined in the framework as any unexpected or unintended event occurring in healthcare that could have or did lead to harm to one or more patients. Thank you, Amanda. There were 3 patient safety incident reporting tools used during the relevant period. The first, the National Reporting and Learning System, NRLS, created in 2003. The Strategic Executive Information System, and the Learn from Patient Safety Event Service, LFPSE. The Strategic Executive Information System was primarily used as a mechanism for trusts to notify regional and national health bodies about incidents meeting the threshold for serious incident, which included never events, a specific type of serious incident listed under NHSE guidance. The NRLS and LFPSE systems are secondary use systems, collating information already on trusts' local risk management systems like Datix and Ulysses. Initially, incident reporting was voluntary. However, providers now have a statutory responsibility to notify the CQC about certain patient safety incidents, such as unexpected deaths. The current framework was implemented following concerns about the earlier serious incident framework by inquiries, investigations and reviews into the NHS. In response to the reports, Improvement launched an engagement programme in March 2018 to gather feedback to support a new approach. Compliance with the framework is a contractual requirement under the NHS standard contract. At the same time, the National Patient Safety Team launched a consultation on developing the first patient safety strategy. Unlike the serious incident framework, the PSIRF does not distinguish between patient safety incidents and serious incidents. Instead, it's intended to promote a proportionate approach to reporting patient safety incidents. NHSE published a template plan and related guidance included in the exhibits. The framework also emphasised the importance of engagement with families and those affected by an incident. The NHSE and CQC were given duties to cooperate with each other under the Health and Social Care Act 2012, and in 2013 they signed a partnership agreement. The agreement set out their respective roles and stipulated the common goal of the delivery of safe and good quality care. The primary statutory responsibility of the CQC is detailed as regular site visits and on-the-ground inspections of care delivery, and the NHSE places considerable reliance on those assessments. There is a joint strategic oversight group which provides a national forum for intelligence sharing and quality surveillance groups which facilitated NHSE engagement with the CQC and other regulators. The model for the groups was first published in 2013. In January 2022, the National Quality Board replaced the quality surveillance groups and risk summits with a new operating model. In relation to emerging concerns and the involvement of professional regulators, it should be noted that the CQC and others concerned with quality and safety and public protection have developed an emerging concerns protocol. The protocol was first published in 2018, having arisen as an action following a forum convened by a meeting of system regulators and professional regulators in October 2016. Professional regulators such as the GMC, the General Medical Council, the local government and the Social Care Ombudsman, Health Education England and the Parliamentary Health Standards Ombudsman are signatories to the protocol. HSIB was established under the NHS Trust Development Authority regulations in 2016. This was an independent division responsible for investigating patient safety incidents, and the incidents investigated were those that the chief investigator considered showed risks affecting patient safety, following which it made recommendations to improve safety. The organisation's role was to encourage a culture of learning and improvement within the NHS. In 2022, the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch became the Health Services Safety Investigation Branch, and that was established on an independent statutory footing with more independence than previously. As to investigations, most investigations are undertaken by providers. NHSE has the power to undertake investigations directly, albeit this power has never been used. The investigations are usually commissioned at regional level. NHSE becomes aware of incidents in several ways, although again they wouldn't be aware of every incident subject to investigation. In some circumstances, the incidents would be escalated to ICBs and then to the NHSE. This would normally be appropriate in situations when, for instance, an independent investigation is deemed necessary to ensure public confidence in investigation integrity, or where the incident represents significant learning potential for the wider system. As an example, there was an NHSE-commissioned independent investigation into homicides committed by patients treated for mental illness in 2013. A medical examiner system was formally implemented in 2023, The system had several purposes, including providing a better service for the bereaved. And in addition, NHSE and the coronial service worked together in relation to prevention of future death reports, and NHSE would often receive those reports in its role as a commissioner. There is a statutory framework for complaints, and any concerns not in the form of complaints would be dealt with informally, and many trusts had PALS, patient advice and liaison services to assist. Concerns could also be referred to the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. As a Commissioner of Mental Health Services, the NHSE required providers to agree arrangements for the delivery of services within the terms of the NHS Standard Contract. The contract requires that a provider complies with its statutory obligations around complaints, and the NHSE also has a duty to handle, record and monitor complaints in its role as a commissioner, regulator, and also under its oversight obligations. Safeguarding is an integral part of providing high-quality healthcare, and NHSE adopts a broad approach to safeguarding. It's responsible for ensuring that the health commissioning system works effectively in safeguarding and promoting the welfare of vulnerable people, and for leading improvement of safeguarding practice. The Chief Nursing Officer has led responsibility for ensuring the effective discharge of those statutory safeguarding responsibilities. NHSE also facilitates the sharing of best practice and safeguarding improvements to ensure the health system is working effectively. In respect of whistleblowing, the NHSE publishes guidance to providers which is intended to set a minimum standard with which providers should comply. National guidance on whistleblowing was first issued in 2016, and it was issued since the NHSE has published a freedom to speak up policy to normalise speaking up for the benefit of patients and workers. This policy came with a guide for leaders in the NHS and organisations delivering services, and all trusts were expected to adopt the policy. In relation to mental health policy specifically, the 5-year forward view was published in 2014, which set out an intention to transform the NHS by 2020. The document was a joint publication by the NHSE, CQC, Health Education England, Monitor, Public Health England and the NHS Trust Development Authority. A further document implementing the 5-year forward view for mental health was published in 2016, which set out plans for developing mental health services following the recommendations of an independent NHSE commissioned report. The NHS long-term plan was published in 2019, which detailed a plan to transform mental health services further. There was subsequently an NHS mental health implementation plan for 2019 to 20 through to 2023-2024 published. The plan detailed aims including eliminating out-of-area placements and reducing the length of inpatient stays. In 2015, NHSE introduced waiting time standards for 3 mental health service areas: talking therapy, early intervention in psychosis, and eating disorder services. And since 2015, the NHS has met the standard for talking therapy and early intervention in psychosis. The NHSE later published a consultation on a range of further proposed waiting times. Also in 2015, they published guidance to the NHS and local authority commissioners setting out a plan for developing community and inpatient facilities close to home. NHSE and NHS Improvement commissioned the Mental Health Safety Improvement Plan, a national patient safety programme, which was developed after a pilot programme saw a significant reduction in the use of restrictive practice. Its aim was to improve safety and experience in mental health, learning disability and autism inpatient services. The programme ran from 2021 to 23 and worked with 54 NHS trusts, as well as the CQC and regional NHS improvement teams. The NHSE then launched a mental health, learning disability and autism inpatient quality transformation programme to develop a new model of care across NHS-funded mental health and inpatient services. The culture of care standards for mental health inpatient services were then published in April 2024. These were co-produced with input from people with lived experience of inpatient services and their families. The culture of care standards included core commitments and standards for the culture of mental health inpatient care. In relation to funding then, NHS England introduced the Mental Health Investment Standard in 2017, requiring commissioners to increase their spend on mental health. As to staffing, NHSE recognised that staff shortages remain a major constraint to improving and expanding mental health services. They published in 2017 and in 2019 estimates of how many additional staff would be required to deliver improved mental health services. In 2023, they published the NHS Long-Term Workforce Plan, which anticipated that demand for mental health services would grow faster than other NHS services. It stated that between 2017 and 2022/23, total spending on mental health services went up by an average of 2.7% a year in real terms. In the same period, spending on children and young people's mental health increased by an average of 7% a year. And mental health spend as a proportion of total recurrent NHS spend increased from 8.9% in 2022-23 to 9% in 23/24. On the topic of suicide specifically, the 5-year forward view made a commitment to reducing suicides nationally. This was supported by the government's National Suicide Prevention Strategy. In September 23, the government published a policy paper on suicide prevention in England, and the NHSE also commissioned the National Confidential Inquiry into Suicide and Homicide. The mental health services data set is dealt with in more detail in a moment in this statement. The data essentially aims to deliver nationally consistent information regarding individuals in contact with mental health services. The data is released regularly via the NHS digital website, and in 2016, the NHSE introduced the Mental Health Dashboard, which aimed to bring together data across mental health services. The second part of this summary relates to out-of-area placements, data systems and inpatient mental health data. The evidence submitted on this was provided in a statement by Claire Paniker, NHSE Regional Director for East of England, dated 24th of March 2025, page 858 in the call bundle. On involvement with mental health services, NHSE has statutory responsibility for commissioning certain mental health services, as we've already said. Not every ICB has every service available in its area, which is why patients may be placed away from home to access appropriate care and treatment. The term natural clinical flow is used to describe appropriate out-of-area placements and defines the range of specialist services available. It must be clinically appropriate for a patient to be placed out of area, proportionate to any risk, and local responsibility and involvement must be maintained. A patient may be placed out of area for reasons including limited provision nationally, patient and/or family choice, and safeguarding considerations. NHSE produced a standard operating procedure, an SOP, on commissioning specialised services in 2020. The SOP reiterated that an out-of-area placement must be clinically appropriate and that all specialised services must have defined natural clinical flows. It also set out the process for out-of-area placements. Mental health data started being reported nationally in 2009. The first set of national mental health data collected was the Mental Health Minimum Data Set. from 2006 to 2014. Between the 1st of September 2014 and 31st of September 2015, data was stored on the Mental Health and Learning Disabilities set. And on the 1st of January 2016, the NHS DS, which was the set mentioned earlier, was introduced. The NHS DS records all activity relating to patients who receive care for a suspected or diagnosed mental health need. And the statement provided to the inquiry notes that record keeping has improved with better IT services. And in 2012, the Health and Social Care Act gave NHSE the power to require data from health and social care bodies. Between 2016 and 2021, additional data was held on the specialised mental health patient level data set, as specialist services were not identifiable in the NHS DS. Those systems were integrated in 2021. Finally then, out of area placements. There is an NHSE spreadsheet on out of area placements provided in the exhibits. It sets out various details regarding the specialised mental health services accessed by patients who are registered with a GP in Essex prior to their admission and placed out of area, as well as those patients placed with independent providers in the relevant period. The data is said to have limitations. For example, it runs from 2016 onwards, as no specialised mental health service data sets were identified prior to that. Exhibited is also a list of all specialised mental health services commissioned by NHSE in the east of England as at June 2021. The inquiry asked NHSE what data it holds nationally for inpatient deaths as defined in its terms of reference. NHSE explained that the NHS DS records the date of an individual's death but does not detail the circumstances. It also notes that the data set is designed to understand current activity flow in secondary mental health services and is not designed to track mortalities within services. Further, the data set is limited in that it will only capture deaths where the person died at the time of being known to the service. Separately, NHSE is informed of and collects information relating to patient safety incidents, including where a patient has died. The Learn from Patient Safety events is said to collect around 2.4 million patient safety incident records each year and can indicate specific mitigating actions to reduce risk. They also located 300 hard copy serious untoward incident reports stored between 2007 and 2010. NHSE was unable to provide certain specific data in relation to inpatient deaths for Essex. In summary, it does not hold specific data regarding patient deaths prior to 2009. For data between 2009 and 2015, data does not provide bed or service type. There is also limited data from independent providers, and this does not include CAMS, or prior to 2014 learning disability and autism patients. And NHSE cannot provide details of those who died whilst awaiting an assessment under the Mental Health Act, those who died whilst waiting for a bed within 3 months of a clinical assessment of need, those who died within 3 months of a decision not to admit, or those who died within 3 months of discharge from an inpatient unit. After 2009, the organisation is able to provide data on those who died on an inpatient unit, on leave, or having absconded, and those who died within 3 months of transfer from inpatient units. That is the summary of NHSE's evidence provided to the inquiry thus far. The last summary relates to evidence from mental health charities. As part of its work, the inquiry sought evidence and information from various mental health charities, and the following is a summary of that evidence that has been provided to the inquiry so far by mental health charities Mind and Rethink Mental Illness. Again, the summary will not cover the totality of the information provided. Starting with Mind, the evidence submitted was provided in a statement signed by Alice Livermore, Head of Legal, and dated 24th of March 2025 at page 1370 in the bundle. The statement provides information on behalf of National Mind and National Mind undertakes its work under 4 headings: campaigns and policy, advocacy and engagement, research and observations, and collaboration with local organisations. National Mind is a mental health charity operating in England and Wales. The senior management team is made up of 6 individuals who are responsible for Mind's overall strategy and for ensuring that its activities are effectively carried out. The Board of Trustees consists of 15 individuals, and the board is responsible for Mind's governance and strategic direction, which includes scrutiny of Mind's performance and support of the executive team of directors. As well as National Mind, there are approximately 100 local minds, which act as independent charities with their own CEOs, boards of trustees, and strategies. Some local minds work in inpatient settings in roles such as independent mental health advocates. Local mind branches may campaign for better local services or join national campaigns. Involvement with inpatient care. One of the pillars of Mind's strategy to 2030 is titled Changing Minds, which details the charity's intentions to tackle injustice and inequity in the delivery of mental health services and to demand services that support people's rights, keeps them safe, and offers them hope regardless of background. Work on inpatient care sits within this pillar. One of the ways in which Mind has contributed to the safety of inpatient care was with the start of its work relating to physical restraint in crisis care in 2010, followed by the launch of a national campaign in 2013. The report Mental Health Crisis Care, Physical Restraint in Crisis made several recommendations, one of which was for NHS England to introduce standardised data capture methods to ensure that every mental health trust is collecting the same data on the use of restraints. Ms Livermore explains that the report in connection with the BBC Panorama documentary on the Winterbourne scandal led to new national guidance and subsequent restriction on the use of restraint. Prior to 2018, Mind worked to influence the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act 2018, liaising with Steve Reed MP to generate support for the bill and strengthen its content. Mind was involved in briefings to MPs and encouraged supporters to write to their MPs asking them to attend to debate the bill. Mind was also involved in the drafting of statutory guidance to accompany the bill, and the bill was given royal assent in 2018. Mind was involved with the independent review of the Mental Health Act from the beginning. Director of External Relations Sophie Corlett was on the working group supporting the chairs in completion of the review. Mind also ran influencing and participation workshops, seeking the views of those with mental health problems to establish what they wanted to campaign for. Strong themes that arose out of the discussions were the presence of racial bias and discrimination and a lack of access and confidence or trust in services. Mind has continued to engage with reform in a number of ways, including the running of a week-long parliamentary exhibition on people's experiences of inpatient admissions. Mind also submitted a response to the government's white paper on reforming the Mental Health Act, and the research highlighted the need for the right to a statutory care plan and safe and therapeutic service environments, amongst other things. Prior to 2018, Mind focused primarily on the rights and needs of adults. In 2022, Mind conducted research into children and young people's experiences of inpatient services. The report, published in 2023, noted serious failings, including young people being placed in adult wards far from home and being unnecessarily medicated and restrained. It found that 45% of children and young people were sectioned 5 times or more, and many were provided with inadequate care in the community, with some leaving hospital without a care plan. In 2023, Mind launched its Raise the Standard campaign, a campaign specifically concerned with inpatient care. The campaign sought several changes, including the reshaping of mental health hospitals as places of hope, dignity and recovery, reforming of the Mental Health Act with changes to give everyone more choice, dignity and control in hospital, and a full statutory inquiry into failings in inpatient mental health services. In the lead up to the campaign, the charity conducted a survey to better understand experiences of inpatient care. In addition, a YouGov poll conducted on behalf of Mind showed that more than a third of respondents said they would not have confidence that a loved one would be safe if they needed inpatient care, or that they would be treated with respect or compassion. One respondent, citing her experience of being sectioned for bipolar disorder 6 times, recalled seeing people manhandled by staff. Visitors to Mind's website for information and support relating to being sectioned in mental health inpatient hospitals has significantly increased, reaching nearly 1 million views in the year 2022 to 23. As to involvement with Essex-based trusts, the statement details that National Mind does not partner with any local healthcare providers in Essex or otherwise. They have held online briefings with providers to give their views on policy matters, such as the NHS long-term plan, and have met with ICBs. The organisation has not met, however, with any Essex-based ICBs. Since this summary was prepared, Mind has provided further evidence to the inquiry by way of a more detailed statement with exhibits. This evidence is currently being reviewed. Finally, the evidence from Rethink Mental Illness. This was provided by Mark Winstanley, Chief Executive, in a statement dated 26th of March 2025. The statement is at page 1377 in the core bundle. Rethink Mental Illness is the leading charity provider of mental health services. Its mission is to improve the lives of people severely affected by mental illness, to provide expert advice, information and training in mental health, and to advance awareness and understanding of the causes, consequences and management of mental illness. The organisation is governed by a board of trustees responsible for the overall direction and control of the charity's activities, and there are 4 committees to assist with its work: Honorary Officers Committee, the Adult and Assurance Committee, Finance and Investment, and the Council of Rethink, which exists to improve the work and governance of the charity. There are also several governance link groups, including a Lived Experience Advisory Board and Carers Advisory Board. These involve a wider range of people interested in contributing to the organisation's work. The statement also details that Rethink holds regional forums designed to enable community feedback and local intelligence. One of the ways that Rethink Mental Illness has been involved in inpatient care is through representation on boards and groups. For example, Mr. Winstanley currently sits on the Mental Health, Learning Disabilities and Autism Quality Transformation Oversight Group, and previously co-chaired the steering group of the Rapid Review into Data on Mental Health Inpatient Settings. Ian Callaghan, Lived Experience Programme Manager, currently sits on the Culture of Care Lived Experience Group and previously worked with the Care Quality Commission, the CQC. Influencing activity is key to Rethink Mental Illness's work for inpatient care, and under that umbrella it has several policy priorities relating to inpatient safety, focused on improving the culture and workforce of inpatient settings, increasing accountability and oversight, and reforming the Mental Health Act. As part of this work, the charity engages with NHSE, the CQC and the DHSE. Rethink fed into HSIB's investigation regarding safe care in the transition from children and young people's mental health services to adult services. Earlier on in that year, which was 2024, Rethink had published a response to the HSIB report concerning the risk of harm in inpatient units specifically. The report cited that the themes are painfully similar. The charity is part of the Mental Health Policy Group, of which Mind is also a member, and it works together to improve mental health. It collaborates by sharing information about policy developments, engaging with government officials, and on occasion submitting joint pieces of work such as consultation responses. The inquiry has already engaged with other members of that group. Rethink Mental Illness's campaigning efforts in relation to mental health inpatient services have primarily concentrated on influencing national policy. The charity founded the Schizophrenia Commission in 2011 and has continued to campaign for reform of the Mental Health Act. This led to the publishing of a report in 2018 titled No Voice, No Choice, Making the Mental Health Act Person-Centred. In 2021, it commissioned 2 papers on the experience of those under section in response to the government's white paper, which we've already heard something about. And in 2022, they submitted evidence to the Joint Committee on the Draft Mental Health Bill. In 2023, the charity launched a campaign called Wrap It Up to persuade the government to reform the Mental Health Act. Following the Dispatches and Panorama documentaries, the charity published 5 recommendations to improve inpatient safety. Those were firstly to improve the mental health workforce, prioritise reform of the Mental Health Act, address the continuing rise in out-of-area placements, work collaboratively with experts by experience, and change the attitude from policymakers. Rethink has conducted a range of research and surveys into the standard of care provided by inpatient wards. For instance, the CQC funded an engagement project on patient safety and care in specialist inpatient mental health services in 2023. That project involved hearing views from a diverse range of people as to what made them feel safe or at risk as a patient. There were several recommendations made as a result of that report. More recently, Rethink Mental Illness issued a response to the review of the CQC in October 2024, citing significant failings in how they were holding services to account. Between July and September 23, the DHSE funded Rethink to conduct a project on mental health crisis, preventions, response and discharge. Several key themes were identified, including a need for greater accessibility to healthcare professionals within inpatient settings and improvements to the discharge process. The organisation was involved in health and mental health equalities with an adult secure care provider collaborative between April and July that year. The themes raised on that occasion included issues with diagnosis and care pathways and restrictive practice. The recommendations called for future engagement and data collection and a better understanding of inequality, amongst other things. One issue that had been previously identified by Rethink was the staggering use of restrictive intervention against Black people. The charity has undertaken projects with NHSE, including assisting in conducting a survey into the views and experiences of people in adult secure services, as well as their families and carers, to ascertain the impact of COVID. And it also supported the development of a carer support and involvement in secure mental health services toolkit. Rethink participated in the consultation on the new service specifications for adult, medium and low secure mental health services. The themes identified included the importance of good communication and adequate staffing levels. As part of this, the charity conducted consultations with 80 people living in secure services. In addition to those, Rethink also worked with NHSE to develop a guide to involvement and co-production to provider collaboratives. Mr. Winstanley notes in his statement that although there have been specific examples of policy changes, there is limited evidence as to how practice has evolved following those changes and the effects that the changes may have had on patient outcomes. One example of a policy change described by him is the 2020-23 Rapid Review, which made several recommendations that were accepted by the government. Rethink published a response, firstly to announce that a review would take place, and secondly to the data itself. Involvement with Essex-based trusts. The primary focus of the campaigns conducted by Rethink Mental Illness is on national policy rather than local issues. The charity does not currently deliver any services in Essex since transferring the improving access to psychological therapies in North East Essex over 10 years ago, and it hasn't conducted any research specifically into inpatient services in Essex. There is, however, a volunteer-run peer support group called Braintree Rethink Carer Support Group, which meets monthly to offer support and raise awareness of the impact of mental illness on carers. Between 2012 and 2019, Rethink ran a regional group in the east of England and in some Essex secure units as part of the National Recovery and Outcomes Network commissioned by the NHS. It also provided advocacy services in Essex between 2018 and 2024. During that time, they raised 109 safeguarding concerns with the local authority, and it said that the concerns would have related to issues such as falls, care plans not being reviewed, and allegations about staff. It's estimated that around 20 of those were related to the local authority, or the NHS Trust and their action or inaction. The Communications and Campaigns team have previously highlighted patient safety issues on inpatient wards, which included responding to the Panorama and Dispatches documentaries. In response to Dispatches, Rethink conducted an internal review to establish the extent of the charity's knowledge of events in Essex, whether their data reflected the findings, and to review their processes for reporting incidents. The report found that none of the individuals in the programme were known to the charity, and the advocates were unaware of the issues. Rethink Mental Illness had, however, reported one concern to the local authority regarding Rochford Hospital, and one relating to the Linden Centre. They considered that appropriate actions had been taken in each case. In 2019, the charity was contacted by a bereaved mother of a patient treated at an inpatient facility in Essex, who asked for support in campaigning for a public inquiry. At the time, the charity had a policy against getting involved with individual cases. In 2021, Rethink declined a request by Inquest for support to call for a statutory inquiry into the deaths and systemic failures in Essex. However, in January 2023, they supported the transition to a statutory inquiry, submitting evidence to support the change in the terms of reference. The charity also revised its policy against advocating for individual cases following the events in Essex. In a response to the BBC investigation into the Priory Group, Rethink published a statement regarding the deaths of specific patients. The charity has identified several areas for improvements in inpatient care. It emphasises the barriers it has encountered, which include lack of funding and inconsistent approaches to engaging with charities and people with lived experience. And the statement cites changes within DHSE and the CQC as contributing to the problem and creating difficulties in meaningful engagement. Mr. Winstanley states that implementation of a reformed Mental Health Act and Code of Practice is a key opportunity to improve inpatient care and safety. Rethink collects feedback in many ways, particularly through surveys of those with lived experience, and it uses this to inform its campaigning, policy, service improvement and strategic recommendations. Finally, Rethink provided some evidence in relation to Oxyvision, and it has highlighted several studies on the topic. Mr. Winstanley notes that there is currently insufficient evidence to suggest that surveillance in inpatient mental health settings is achieving its intended outcomes of improving safety and reducing costs. He also stated that several studies on the use of Oxyvision have been conducted by OxyHealth, the company making Oxyvision, presenting a possible conflict of interest. Ian Callaghan attended a conference in 2024 at which NHSE set out the principles for Oxyvision. Rethink Mental Illness is of the view that the opportunities and risks of new technology need to be openly discussed to balance safety with the needs and views of patients. As outlined at the start of this summary, the inquiry has sought evidence from and or is engaging with a number of mental health charities, and the inquiry continues to consider carefully whether and when it should approach other similar organisations to assist. Chair, that concludes the evidential summaries at this stage.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Chair, that's all the evidence to be presented to the inquiry today. As confirmed yesterday, the inquiry is not holding a public hearing tomorrow in respect of the evidence relating to Oxyvision. And the reason for this, as explained by Mr Griffin, King's Counsel, was the late disclosure by EPUT of a statement in relation to major policy and procedural change in their use of Oxyvision. And Chair, you have expressed your dissatisfaction in that regard. The inquiry will resume its public hearing on Thursday morning, Thursday the 15th of May at 10 o'clock, when the inquiry will hear from Paul Scott, the Chief Executive of EPUT.
Thank you very much. 10 o'clock on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.